The term crimes against humanity was coined and used for the first time ever in 1890 by former American Civil War soldier, Baptist minister, politician, lawyer, journalist, and writer on African American history, George Washington Williams. Williams used the term to describe what he had seen with his own eyes. Acts committed by King Leopold II of Belgium during his sole administration of the Congo Free State, present-day Democratic Republic of Congo. Leopold was a first cousin to Queen Victoria of England, and only the second King of Belgium, reigning from 1865 to 1909. He ruled at a time when Europeans were scrambling to colonize and effectively occupy territory in Africa. Leopold's claim had been aided by Welsh-American journalist, explorer, soldier, colonial administrator, author, and politician Henry Morton Stanley. The United States of America would go on to be the first nation to recognize Leopold's claim over the Congo, followed by France and Germany. The Congo became Leopold's personal possession. He was the sole owner and absolute ruler of the Congo Free State from 1885 to 1908. At the Berlin Conference, the colonial nations of Europe agreed to Leopold's claim, giving him a green light to go and extract generational wealth from the territory. Initially from the collection of ivory, but after a rise in the price of rubber in the 1890s by forced labor of the native population. To date, 6 generations of Belgians have been taught in history class, decade after decade, that Leopold was a great humanitarian who brought Christianity and civilization to the Congo Free State. The reality, however, is as described by George Washington Williams. King Leopold II of Belgium committed crimes against humanity in the Congo during the period of European colonialization in Africa. It was the first major international atrocity scandal in the age of the telegraph and the camera. The vilest scramble for loot to ever disfigure the history of human conscience. This is the story of how one man schemed, plotted, executed a strategy so outrageous he stole a whole nation. Leopold II inherited the distinct title by which Belgian monarchs were known, King of the Belgians, on the death of his father Leopold I in 1865. When Leopold I had come to the throne, Belgium was a young country following spells of Spanish, Austrian, French, and Dutch rule. Belgium had only gained independence in 1830 following a revolt against Holland. After the revolt, the infant nation had gone looking for a king. After all, any respectable country needed a king. They settled on a German prince, a first cousin to Queen Victoria and the British royal family. This prince took the Belgian throne as King Leopold I of Belgium. Growing up, the young heir to the Belgian throne took little to no interest in his studies, with the notable exception of geography. From the age of 10, Leopold was given military training. By 15, he held the rank of lieutenant in the Belgian army. At 16, captain. At 18, major. At 19, colonel. And by the time he was 20, he was a major general in the Belgian army. In 1853, when Leopold turned 18, his father took him to Vienna and, eager for ties with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, betrothed him to an eligible young Habsburg, Archduchess Marie Henriette. This was a disastrous match. Leopold and Marie Henriette loathed each other at first sight, feelings that apparently never changed throughout their marriage. She was sporting with a passion for horses. He, on the other hand, had a distinct tendency to fall off horses. Leopold would go for days at a time without speaking to Marie Henriette, and only a month after their wedding she wrote to a friend,
"If God hears my prayers, I won't go on living much longer."
The marriage would bear children but remain miserable. Marie Henriette fled and took up residence at the royal chateau of Laeken, where she spent her time horseback riding most of each day. Leopold would find ample respite from his frustrations on a wider world stage. Leopold, like his father, thought Belgium, and furthermore the Belgian throne, not to be on the grand scale befitting a true king. Belgium, less than half the size of West Virginia, lay between Napoleon III's much grander France and the fast-rising German Empire. The country he was to inherit seemed too small to hold him, and his eyes turned abroad. By the time he turned 20, Leopold was much travelled. With pen and notebook in hand, he visited the Balkans, Constantinople, the Aegean, and Egypt. Everywhere he travelled, he was on the lookout for imperial opportunities. He tried unsuccessfully to buy lakes in the Nile Delta so that he could drain them and claim the land as a colony. He was frustrated by his parliament's lack of appetite for imperial conquest, once writing, "One could purchase a small kingdom in Abyssinia for 30,000 francs. If instead of talking so much about neutrality, Parliament looked after our commerce, Belgium would become one of the richest countries in the world." In March 1862, aged 26, Leopold visited the Spanish city of Seville. Seville was a magnificent city. Visitors thronged the city to look at one of the largest Gothic cathedrals in Europe. Leopold, though, had not come to admire the cathedrals or famous mosaics and courtyards of the brightly tiled Alcazar Palace. He instead spent a full month in the Casa Longa, or Old Exchange Building, a massive square structure opposite the cathedral. He would write home to a friend during his month's stay in Seville, "I'm very busy here going through the Indies archives and calculating the profits which Spain made then and makes now out of her colonies." To Leopold, colonies existed for one purpose. He did not care whether the colonial wealth he wanted came from precious metals, agriculture, or, as would turn out to be the case, from raw material whose potential was as yet undreamed of. What mattered most were the size of the profits. Seville had been a city where for 2 centuries colonial gold, silver, and other riches had flowed back to Spain. In 1855, 8 years before Leopold's visit, King Carlos III had ordered that they be gathered in this building from all corners of the country all decrees, government and court records, correspondence, maps, architectural drawings, having to do with Spanish conquest of the Americas. Collected under one roof were 86 million handwritten pages, among them the supply manifest of one of Columbus's ships, making the General Archives of the Indies one of the greatest repositories of the world. In 1864, aged 29, Leopold would read on the Dutch East Indies in a 2-volume treatise called Java, or How to Manage a Colony, written by an English lawyer aptly named J.W.B. Money. Fascinated by the book, Leopold began corresponding with the author. J.W.B. Money had been impressed by the coffee, sugar, indigo, and tobacco plantations of Java, whose profits had paid for railroads and canals back in Holland. Money critically observed that Dutch plantation owners paid bonuses to supervisors on Java in relation to the size of the crop harvested. The huge Dutch profits from Java depended on forced labor, and Leopold agreed, remarking that forced labor was the only way to civilize and uplift these indolent and corrupt peoples of the Far East. In 1875, Leopold tried to buy the Philippines from Spain, but was once again frustrated. "For the moment, neither the Spanish nor the Portuguese nor the Dutch are inclined to sell," he wrote to one of his officials that year, and then he added, "I intend to find out discreetly if there's anything to be done in Africa." Only in Africa could Leopold hope to achieve his dream of seizing a colony, never mind one that would be immensely larger than Belgium. There was no more unclaimed territory in the Americas. There were no blank spaces in Asia. The Russian Empire stretched all the way to the Pacific. The French had taken Indochina, the Dutch the East Indies, and most of the rest of Southern Asia, from Aden to Singapore, was colored with the British Empire red. Only Africa remained. In the mid-1870s, about 80% of the entire land area of Africa was still under indigenous rulers. The British and Boer controlled South Africa, and an enfeebled Portugal claimed most of what used to be the Kingdom of the Congo, as well as Mozambique on the east coast. Along Africa's Great Western Bulge, Portugal, Spain, Britain, and France owned a few islands and small pockets of territory. To European colonial powers, Africa was ripe for conquest, or, as Leopold was now learning to say, for protection. Leopold closely and carefully combed the proceedings of the Royal Geographical Society for any information about the continent he could obtain, and he keenly followed the tracks of white explorers. In 1875, Scottish explorer Fernie Lovett Cameron, about to become the first European to cross Africa from east to west, was reported to be running out of money. Leopold swiftly offered a contribution of 100,000 francs. Although the money would eventually not be needed, this gesture alone had declared to the public that King Leopold II of Belgium was a great, generous patron of African exploration. In 1874, a year before Fernie Lovett Cameron's expedition, Henry Morton Stanley had set off from the east coast to the interior, the equatorial heart of the continent where no European had yet been, the biggest blank space on European maps and knowledge of Africa. In Stanley's newspaper dispatches, descriptions of Arab slave traders leading sad caravans of chained captives to Africa's east coast had succeeded in stirring European revulsion. Revulsion that would provide the perfect cover for King Leopold II of Belgium to realize his grand ambition for a colony to exploit. As king of a small country with no public interest in colonies, Leopold II recognized that a colonial push of his own would require a strong humanitarian veneer. Curbing the slave trade, moral uplift, and the advancement of science were the aims he would talk about, not profits. In 1876, Leopold began planning steps to establish his image as a philanthropist and advance his African ambitions. He would host a conference of explorers and geographers. He sent a trusted aide to Berlin to recruit German participants, while he himself slipped across the English Channel to London, settling into a suite at Claridge's. On this trip, his frustrations are carefully concealed, his raw lust for colonies moderated by the knowledge that he must depend on subterfuge and flattery. He would pay a visit to dear cousin Victoria at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, dine twice with her son, the Prince of Wales, and visit eminent geographers and military men. Most shrewdly, he goes for lunch with Angela Burdett Coutts, a baroness and well-known patron of missionaries. Most importantly, he meets the explorer Fernie Lovett Cameron, recently returned from crossing Africa, and grills him about his travels. To Leopold's delight, he finds out the British have no interest in the great swath of territory Cameron has just explored. Most of it is believed to be the basin of the Congo River. Although Cameron himself traveled far south of the river, and like everyone else in Europe, he still had no clear idea of its course. This is the land that now becomes the object of the king's desires. Leopold's Geographical Conference convened in Brussels in September 1876. Among the 13 Belgians and 24 foreign guests were famous explorers like France's Marquis de Champagne, who had gone up the Ogwe River in Gabon, and Germany's Gerhard Rolfs, who incredibly had himself circumcised so he could pass for a Muslim while trekking to remote parts of the Sahara. Geographers like Baron Ferdinand van Richthofen, the president of the Berlin Geographical Society, humanitarians like Sir Thomas Vauxhall Buxton, president of Britain's Anti-Slavery Society, and Sir John Kennaway, president of the Church Missionary Society. Business executives like William McKinnon of the British India Line, and military men like Rear Admiral Sir Leopold Heath of Britain, who had headed the Royal Navy's Indian Ocean Anti-Slavery Patrol, and Vice Admiral Baron de la Roncière-le-Nouroy, president of the Paris Geographical Society. Never in the 19th century had so many eminent Europeans in the field of exploration gathered in one spot. The only notable European concerned with Africa missing was Stanley, whose work the conference acknowledged with a formal resolution. He was, as everyone hoped, still alive somewhere in the middle of the continent. There had been no news of him for months. On the opening day, Leopold's welcoming speech was a masterpiece, for it closed the whole enterprise in noble rhetoric, staked out his own role in what was to come, and guaranteed his plans a stamp of approval by the group he was hosting. Leopold would end his speech by naming the specific tasks he hoped the conference would accomplish. Among them was deciding on the location of routes to be successively opened into the interior. Base stations were to be set up as a means of abolishing the slave trade, establishing peace among the chiefs, and procuring them just and impartial arbitration. To chair the conference, Leopold selected Russian geographer Pyotr Semenov, daring explorer of the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia. Semenov knew next to nothing about Africa, and this suited Leopold perfectly. He was able to easily maneuver Semenov so that the chain of bases endorsed by the conference would stretch across the unclaimed territory of the Congo River basin that interested Leopold most. The guests, prior to departure to their respective home countries, voted to establish the International African Association. Leopold magnanimously volunteered space in Brussels for the organization's headquarters. National committees of the association were to be set up in all the participating countries, as well as an international committee. Leopold was elected by acclamation as the international committee's first chairman. Self-effacingly, he said that he would serve for 1 year only, so that the chairmanship could rotate among people from different countries. The new body was welcomed throughout Europe. Prominent citizens, from the Rothschilds to Viscount Ferdinand de Lesseps, the builder of the Suez Canal, hastened to send contributions. The national committees, which sounded impressive, were to be headed by Grand Dukes, princes, and other royals, but most of them never got off the ground. The International Committee did meet once in the following year, re-elected Leopold as chairman, despite his earlier pledge not to serve again, then evaporated. Leopold had learned from his many attempts to buy a colony that none were for sale. He would have to conquer it. However, doing this openly was certain to upset not only the people of Belgium, but the major powers of Europe. If he was to seize anything in Africa, he could do so only if he convinced everyone that his interest was purely altruistic. In this aim, thanks to the International African Association, he succeeded brilliantly. Viscount de Lesseps declared Leopold's plans the greatest humanitarian work of this time. The town of Boma lay on the Congo River's north shore, about 50 miles in from the Atlantic Ocean. Besides its African inhabitants, in 1877, 16 whites lived there, most of them Portuguese. These traders, like their European kin several centuries before them, had never tracked inland through the forbidden jumble of rocks lining the great river on the tumultuous 220 miles of intermittent rapids that carried it down to sea level. On the 5th of August 1877, 4 African men walked out of the bush at Boma, carrying a letter addressed to any gentleman who speaks English at Mboma. Dear Sir, I have arrived at this place from Zanzibar with 155 souls, men, women, and children. We are now in a state of imminent starvation. The white man at Boma realized instantly what the letter meant. Stanley had crossed the entire African continent, from east to west, but unlike the only other European at the time to accomplish this, Verney Lovett Cameron, Stanley had emerged at the Congo's mouth. He must have therefore followed the river itself, becoming the first white man to chart its course and solve the mystery of where it came from. Explorers congratulated Stanley, and a joint resolution from both houses of the United States Congress hailed his descent of the Congo as the century's greatest feat of exploration. In public statements after his trip, Stanley made the usual condemnation of the Arab slave trade and called for missionaries to come to Africa and proclaimed that the aim of his journey was to flash a torch of light across the western half of the dark continent. Commerce and profit, too, were on his mind as he wrote after leaving one district. A farewell to it, until some generous and opulent philanthropist shall permit me, or some other, to lead a force for the suppression of this stumbling block to commerce with Central Africa. For several months before Stanley emerged at Boma, Leopold had eagerly scanned the Times of London daily for news of his fate. Leopold read the long Daily Telegraph articles Stanley wrote about his journey, as well as the voluminous press reports on the accolades and banquets the explorer received in Cape Town, Cairo, and his other stops on his way back to England. Leopold was now certain that this vast territory in the middle of Africa, miraculously still unclaimed by any European power, could become the colony he craved. Behind the elegant smokescreen of his International African Association, Leopold was maneuvering with great subtlety and told his minister in London, "I think I'll give Stanley some job of exploration, which would offend no one, but will give us the bases and headquarters which we can take over later on." Leopold mapped a plan to intercept Stanley on his way home and lure him to Brussels. In Alexandria, where he had stopped for a few days, the king arranged for someone to plant the idea with Stanley while he was the guest of honor at a dinner on board a yacht carrying former U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant. In the next step of his courtship of Stanley, Leopold turned for help to an American friend in Brussels, General Henry Shelton Stanley. The general was eager to take on this glorious mission for Leopold. He was born to a wealthy Connecticut family and had been appointed by Abraham Lincoln as American minister to Belgium. Sanford had never been a soldier. However, the title, ceremonial sword, and blue and gold uniform he wore for some years were rewards for his having given a battery of cannon to an infantry regiment during the American Civil War. Sanford had invested in American railroads, Western real estate, in huge citrus orchards, and other enterprises in Florida, giving the town that sprung up to house their workers the name Sanford. Sanford had the elegance of someone who grew up with a fortune, but not the shrewdness needed to make one. He lost money on everything he touched. He never recovered the large sums he put into a series of odd patents for a wool loom, a new type of whiskey still, and a little box designed to lubricate railroad car axles with water instead of oil. A silver mine in Nevada and a zinc mine in Arkansas proved disastrous. A Minnesota railroad went bankrupt. His cotton crop at a South Carolina plantation was devoured by caterpillars. As Sanford watched his fortune draining away, his connects at the Belgium court loomed larger for him. He even named one of his sons, Leopold. Always a shrewd judge of people, the king understood what royal patronage would mean to Sanford, and he flattered him ceaselessly, knowing that someday he could use him. When Sanford failed in one of many fruitless efforts to win another American diplomatic post, Leopold's aide, Baron Jules Grendel, wrote to him, "The king is pleased that you will continue to reside among us, where everyone loves and appreciates you." Like many Americans, Sanford had a fondness for royalty, and Leopold valued him, he felt, in a way that his own country did not. In January 1878, Leopold secretly dispatched Sanford and Grendel to intercept Stanley in France, where the explorer, still on his way to London, was due for another round of medals and banqueting. At the Marseille railway station, the envoys caught up with Stanley, who was thin, ill, and exhausted, and followed him to Paris, where they formally offered him a job with the International African Association. He was clearly gratified, but turned down their invitation. Stanley, however, never forgot that courtiers of the King of the Belgians, a baron and a general no less, had sought him out on his return to Europe. Leopold would continue to press his suit with overtures, and he knew his man, making sure Stanley heard a few hints about his possibly making a deal with another explorer instead. On the 10th of June 1878, a steamer carried Henry Morton Stanley across the English Channel for his first meeting with the King of the Belgians. Leopold was 43 years old when he first met Stanley in June 1878. The pedantic awkwardness of his youth far behind him, he had learned to play the role of royal superbly. Stanley, despite being a head shorter than the king and younger at 37 years of age, had come into his own. He was now a best-selling author, recognized as one of the greatest living explorers. His face appeared in magazines everywhere beneath the Stanley cap, his own invention. The Stanley cap had a high crown surrounded by ventilation holes, a brim over the eyes, and a havelock, a cloth to keep the sun off ears and neck. After their meeting in June 1878, Stanley would travel the rest of the year promoting his book through the Dark Continent, meeting members of the New Stanley Club in Paris and receiving honors everywhere. Leopold sent emissaries after him to keep his man on the hook. Before the year was out, the two had agreed terms of Stanley's return to the Congo, this time working for the king. Stanley's contract would run for 5 years. He would be paid 25,000 francs a year for time spent in Europe and 50,000 francs a year for time spent in Africa, and Leopold would fund the expeditionary force to accompany him. He could write a book about his experiences, but Leopold would have the right to edit it. They agreed that Stanley would first set up a base near the river's mouth and then construct a road around the rapids, through the rugged Crystal Mountains. Over this road, porters would carry several steamboats broken down into small pieces, which Stanley would later assemble and use to travel upstream, building a chain of trading stations along the 1,000-mile navigable main stretch of the Congo River. For 5 years, Stanley was Leopold's man in the Congo. He was at heart a military man who liked order and discipline and was a terrifying commander. He amassed a powerful private army, equipped with 1,000 quick-firing Snider rifles, a dozen small Krupp cannon, and 4 machine guns. His crew of workmen carved a rough track, more a trail than a road, around the big rapids, using existing paths in some areas, in others cutting through brush and forest, filling in gullies, and throwing log bridges over ravines. They moved 50 tons of supplies and equipment up the trail. Because draft animals like horses and oxen could not survive the Congo's climate and diseases, so supplies traveled mostly on porters' heads. After 2 years of trail building, pulling and hauling, 2 small steamboats were reassembled at the top of the rapids and puffed their way up the river to land parties that set up more bases on its banks. Leopold and Stanley knew that other Europeans would eventually start to nose around the basin. Their chief worry was the French explorer and naval officer Count Pierre Savignon de Brazza, who had landed on the coast north of the Congo River and headed inland. Stanley would be shocked to find that at Stanley Pool, de Brazza had signed a treaty with the chief ceding to France a strip of the northern shoreline. De Brazza had then left a sergeant in command of an outpost there, flying the French flag. Over the next few years, Stanley and de Brazza carried on a loud feud that would attract interest of not only the French press, but other colonial players. Portugal resurrected her claim to the land surrounding the Congo River's mouth. Britain, worried by French interest in the Congo, backed the Portuguese. Leopold felt he had no time to waste. As ambitious as Leopold and Stanley's plans were, Leopold was intent that they be seen as nothing more than philanthropy. The contract Stanley made his European staff sign forbade them to divulge anything about the real purpose of their work. Only scientific explorations are intended, Leopold assured journalists. To obfuscate things still further and give his African operations a name that could serve for a political entity, Leopold created another new organization, the International Association of the Congo. This was intentional and calculated to sound confusingly similar to the moribund philanthropic International African Association of Crown Princes and Explorers. Care must be taken not to let it be obvious that the Association of the Congo and the African Association are two different things, Leopold instructed one of his aides. The public doesn't grasp that. To add further to the public's confusion, the new International Association of the Congo would use the same flag as the now defunct Committee for Studies of the Upper Congo, a gold star on a blue background. Leopold hired an Oxford scholar, Sir Travis Twiss, to provide a learned legal opinion, backing the right of private companies to act as if they were sovereign countries when making treaties with native chiefs. The king did not believe African chiefs should retain sovereignty over their land and instructed Stanley, "The treaties must be brief as possible, and in a couple of articles must grant us everything." By the time Stanley and others working for the king were done, the blue flag with the gold star fluttered over the villages and territories of more than 450 Congo basin chiefs. The text may have varied, but the treaties gave the king a complete trading monopoly, despite insistence to Europeans and Americans he was opening up Africa for free trade. Chiefs signed over their land to Leopold for almost nothing. Many had no idea what they were signing. Few had seen the written word before, and they were being asked to mark their X's to documents in foreign languages and legalese. To the chiefs, the idea of treaties were familiar. However, the idea of signing over one's land to someone on the other side of the ocean was inconceivable. On the 1st of April 1884, the chiefs of Ngombe and Mafela may not have understood that in return for one piece of cloth per month, they promised to freely of their own accord, for themselves and their heirs and successors forever, give up to the said association the sovereignty and all sovereign and governing rights to all their territories, and to assist by labor or otherwise any works, improvements, or expeditions which the said association shall cause at any time to be carried out in any part of these territories. All roads and waterways running through this country, the right of collecting tolls on the same, and all game, fishing, mining, and forest rights are to be the absolute property of the said association. Stanley's piece of cloth on behalf of the king bought not just land, but manpower, surely a worse trade than the Native Americans made for Manhattan. In April 1883, American President Chester A. Arthur headed south for vacation. Arthur's high blood pressure and other complaints had left him tired, he told his staff, and he wanted a good rest in Florida. In Jacksonville, Florida, the president and his entourage boarded a paddle-wheel steamer and headed up the winding St. Johns River. They disembarked some 35 miles from today's Disney World to visit the elegant mansion on the Bel Air Orange Plantation. The owner of the Bel Air Orange Plantation was General Henry Shelton Stanley, the man who helped Leopold recruit Stanley. Initially, Sanford did not leave his home in Belgium to be in Florida for the president's visit. He made sure the president and his party were greeted by his personal agent and that they got the best rooms at the Sanford House Hotel, which stood on the lakeshore fringed with palm trees in the town of Sanford. Sanford was a longtime supporter of President Arthur's Republican Party, and for 2 years he had been corresponding with Arthur and other high United States officials about supporting Leopold's plans for the Congo. The agreement Leopold wanted was one that gave full American diplomatic recognition of his claim to the Congo. When the king felt confident Arthur would pay more attention, he sent Sanford in person across the Atlantic to make use of his connections to the White House. On the 27th of November 1883, Sanford's ship arrived in New York. He boarded the overnight train for Washington and was received by President Arthur at the White House on the 29th of November 1883. Sanford carried with him letters to the president from the king. Some the king himself had edited and carefully translated. "Entire territories ceded by sovereign chiefs have been constituted by us into independent states," Leopold declared. Sanford also had a copy of one of Leopold's treaties with a Congo chief. However, The copy too had been edited and carefully translated in Brussels to omit any mention of the monopoly on trade ceded to Leopold. This alteration deceived not only Arthur, but also Sanford, an ardent free trader who wanted the Congo open to American businessmen like himself. Sanford then went to work on Congress, renting a house at 1925 G Street, a few blocks from the White House, telegraphed for his wife and chef to come over from Belgium, and then began wining and dining senators, representatives, and cabinet members. The affable personality that made him both a bon vivant and a poor businessman served him wonderfully well as a lobbyist. He had an excellent wine cellar, and he was called the gastronomic diplomat, waging a gastronomic campaign. As he was winning congressional support for Leopold's claim to the Congo, Sanford found an unexpected ally, Senator John Tyler Morgan of Alabama, a former Confederate brigadier general and chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Like most Southern politicians of the era, he was frightened by the specter of millions of freed slaves and their descendants harboring threatening dreams of equality. To Morgan and politicians in his mold, Leopold's new state seemed heaven-sent. In early 1884, Morgan introduced a Senate resolution in support of Leopold's Congo claims. Knowing how carefully President Arthur's Republicans listened to business, Sanford got the New York Chamber of Commerce to pass a resolution endorsing U.S. recognition of Leopold's association. Sanford's multi-layered campaign was probably the most sophisticated piece of Washington lobbying on behalf of a foreign ruler in the 19th century, and it bore fruit on the 22nd of September, 1884. The Secretary of State declared that the United States of America recognized King Leopold II's claim of the Congo. It was the first country to do so. During his Washington lobbying, Sanford and Leopold had passed around documents that thoroughly jumbled up the names of the International Association of the Congo, entirely controlled by Leopold, and the International African Association, at this point now defunct but still vaguely remembered as a philanthropic society of famous explorers, crown princes, and grand dukes. As in Washington, the king had his own man in Paris, a well-connected art dealer named Arthur Stevens, who negotiated directly with Premier Hugh Ferrer, while Leopold paid a large monthly stipend to a journalist from the influential Le Temps to ensure a stream of sympathetic articles about his activities in the Congo. The French did not feel threatened by tiny Belgium or by the vast size of Leopold's claims. Their main fear was that when the king ran out of money, as they were sure he would, in his expensive plan to build a railway around the rapids, he might sell the whole territory to their main colonial rival, Britain. Leopold calculated this French concern might actually aid his cause. To allay French anxiety, Leopold offered a remedy. If France would respect his claim, he would give the country droit de préférence over the Congo. The French, relieved, quickly agreed. Confident that Leopold's planned railway would bankrupt him and that he would then have to sell them the land, they thought they were getting an excellent deal. The German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck saw through Leopold's claim from the start and thought it was a swindle and fantasies. Leopold, however, turned to the perfect intermediary, Bismarck's friend and banker, the financier of the St. Gotthard Tunnel under the Alps and many other projects, Gerson Blachrode. Blachrode quietly bought goodwill for Leopold by conveying a 40,000 franc royal contribution to Berlin's Africa Society. Blachrode eventually brought his friend the Chancellor around to accepting Leopold's claim for the Congo. In return, Blachrode received some banking business from advisors to Leopold and the chance to invest in the Congo himself. In the summer of 1884, Bismarck let himself be convinced that it was better for the Congo to go to the king of a weak little Belgium and be open to German traders than go to the protection-minded France or Portugal or to powerful Britain. In return for guarantees of freedom of trade in the Congo, he agreed to recognize the new state. In Europe, The thirst for African land had become nearly palpable. There were some conflicting claims to be resolved, and clearly some ground rules were needed for further division of the African cake. Bismarck offered to host a diplomatic conference in Berlin to discuss some of these issues. This presented an opportunity for Leopold to tighten his grip on the Congo. On the 15th of November 1884, representatives of the powers of Europe assembled at a large horseshoe table overlooking the garden of Bismarck's yellow brick official residence on the Wilhelmstrasse. At the table, the ministers and plenipotentiaries who took their seats before a large map of Africa, dressed in formal attire, included counts, barons, colonels, and a vizier from the Ottoman Empire. The Berlin Conference was the ultimate expression of an age whose newfound enthusiasm for democracy had clear limits. Slaughtered game had no vote. With his embryonic state already recognized by the United States and Germany, and with his friendly right of first refusal deal made with France, Leopold was in a strong position. His International Association of the Congo was not a government. In fact, conference delegates seemed confused as to just what it was, so it was not officially represented at Berlin, but Leopold had no problem staying abreast of what went on at the conference. In the German capital, keeping a close ear to the ground, was his friend Blachruder, who was a host to the delegates at an elegant dinner. The king had ties with no fewer than 3 of the national delegations. The Belgian representatives were his trusted underlings. One of them was appointed secretary of the meeting. Leopold was unusually well informed about confidential matters in the British Foreign Office. A legal advisor to the British delegation was Sir Travis Twiss, who had recently consulted for Leopold about his treaties with the Congo chiefs. One of the 2 American delegates to the conference was Henry Shelton Stanley, who sent Leopold informative dispatches almost daily. Finally, the technical advisor to the American delegation completed the king's coup de grace, even as he remained on Leopold's payroll, Mr. Henry Morton Stanley. In Berlin, almost none of the conference participants except Stanley had seen more of Africa than the drawings of its scenery on the menu for Bismarck's banquets. When anyone seemed unclear about why Leopold's claim was so grand, Stanley could speak with the authority of someone who had just spent 5 years in the Congo for the king. Most Belgians had paid little attention to their king's flurry of African diplomacy, but once it was over, they began to realize, with surprise, that his new colony was bigger than England, Germany, Spain, and Italy combined. It was 1/13 of the African continent, more than 76 times the size of Belgium itself. To make clear the distinction between his 2 roles, the king of the Belgians at first considered calling himself Emperor of the Congo. He also toyed with the idea of outfitting loyal chiefs with uniforms modeled on those of the famous red-clad beefeaters at the Tower of London. He finally decided to be merely Congo's king sovereign. Leopold's power as king sovereign of the Congo was shared in no way with the Belgian government, whose cabinet ministers were surprised as anyone when they opened their newspapers to find out that Congo had promulgated a new law or signed a new international treaty. Even though the entity officially recognized by the Berlin Conference and various governments had been the International African Association or the International Association of the Congo, Leopold decided on yet another change of name. The pretense that there was a philanthropic association involved in the Congo was allowed to evaporate. All that remained unchanged was the blue flag with a gold star. By royal decree, on the 29th of May 1885, the king named his new, privately controlled country État indépendant du Congo, the Congo Free State. Soon there was a national anthem, Towards the Future. At last, age 50, King Leopold II of Belgium had the colony he had long dreamed of.